The final battle raged on under the darkened skies of the alien planet, and Princess Leora stood at the palace's balcony, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sounds of war were distant now, but the weight of the moment still pressed heavily upon her chest. The enemy forces had pushed her kingdom to the brink, and for years she had led her people through constant conflict. But now, today, the war was finally reaching its peak. Her heart beat faster as the report came in. The human captain, Kalen, had launched a risky assault on the enemy's main fortress. His tactical brilliance had already won them several crucial victories, but this final strike was unlike anything they had attempted before. The weight of responsibility for the kingdom and its people hung heavy on her shoulders. She knew that the outcome of this battle would determine not only her reign but the future of her people. Despite the chaos of the battlefield, Leora's mind kept drifting back to memories of a time long past. A time when she and a boy named Kalen had played together in the royal gardens, carefree and full of laughter. They had been the best of friends, inseparable in their youth, sharing secrets and dreams for the future. But that was before the war came, before the tragedy that tore their worlds apart. Kalen had vanished into the distant reaches of the galaxy, lost to her, and she had never imagined that their paths would cross again, especially in such a way. As the palace's communication system crackled to life, her thoughts were abruptly interrupted. A soldier's voice came through the static, his words cutting through the tension. "Your Highness, the final assault has been completed. The enemy is retreating. The war is over." Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she felt an overwhelming mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The war had cost her so much. Friends, allies, and so many innocent lives. But it was over. Her kingdom was safe. Yet there was something more in the air now. An unease that gnawed at her. She had been so focused on the war that she hadn't stopped to think about the personal consequences. Kalen, the soldier who had led them to victory, had become a legend among the people. But what if the Kalen she once knew was lost forever? What if the boy she had shared her childhood with was no longer the person she would find standing before her? As the doors to the palace throne room opened, the silence was broken by the entrance of Captain Kalen. He stood tall and confident, the war-torn uniform still clinging to his frame, but there was something about his demeanor that felt familiar. His sharp eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Leora, she felt a jolt of recognition, something deep inside her stirring. The years had changed him, but the boy she once knew was still there, somewhere beneath the soldier's hardened exterior. It was then that it hit her. The soldier who had won the war was the same Kalen from her childhood. As Captain Kalen stepped into the throne room, Leora's heart skipped a beat. The soldier standing before her was no stranger, yet everything about him felt foreign. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, pausing only when they met hers. For a brief moment, the bustling sounds of the palace seemed to fade, and all that remained was the quiet connection between them. Leora's pulse quickened, and she felt a lump form in her throat. Could it be him? Could this be the boy she had once shared secrets with, the boy who had been her closest friend, the one who had disappeared years ago with no word? She hadn't expected to see him again, and certainly not in such a way. Standing here as a decorated hero, his face hardened by battle. Kalen's confident stride faltered for just a split second as his gaze locked with hers. His lips tightened, and for a brief instant, Leora thought she saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. But the soldier in him quickly masked any trace of emotion, replaced by the cool professionalism that had made him the hero of the war. "Princess Leora." Kalen's voice broke through the silence, low and steady, carrying the weight of the war they had just fought. "The battle is won. The enemy forces have retreated." His words were formal, but his gaze lingered on her, betraying a hint of something more, something she couldn't quite place. Leora stood frozen, struggling to find the right words. Her mind raced, memories of their childhood flooding back, of the two of them playing in the palace gardens, of their shared laughter and dreams for the future. They had been inseparable, but then, as war broke out, Kalen had been swept away by circumstances beyond their control. She had lost touch with him, not knowing where he had gone, nor if he had survived the chaos of the universe. She cleared her throat, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "You," she began, her words faltering. "You were the one leading the final charge." Her mind struggled to catch up with her emotions. This man, this soldier, was the same boy who had once been her closest friend. But where had the years gone? What had happened to the boy she had known, the one who had been so full of life and dreams? The man before her was so different, shaped by the brutal realities of war, his innocence lost in the heat of battle. Kalen gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "I led the charge, Your Highness. It was the only way to ensure the enemy's surrender." His words were calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Leora's chest tighten. This was the same boy she had once known, yet the weight of war had changed him in ways she couldn't fully understand. There was a long silence between them as they stood in the throne room, the air thick with unspoken words. Leora's mind raced with a mix of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a deep yearning to reconnect with the boy who had once meant so much to her. She had to know more. How had he become the man before her? What had happened in all the years that had passed? And yet, as much as she wanted to ask, she couldn't help but feel that the answers might come at a cost, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The silence in the room stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Leora took a hesitant step forward, her eyes still locked on Kalen. The years that had passed seemed to vanish for a moment, and in their place was the lingering connection from their childhood, unspoken, but undeniably strong. Kalen had changed so much, but Leora couldn't help but feel that the essence of who he was, the boy she once knew, still lived within him. She could see it in his eyes, those eyes that had always been kind and full of hope, even in their darkest moments. "Kalen." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't care. His name felt strange on her lips now, like a forgotten melody she had longed to hear again. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment, there was a flicker of emotion, a brief break in his soldier-like composure. He looked at her as though he wanted to say something, but the words seemed to escape him. Leora swallowed hard, stepping closer. "I never thought I would see you again. After all these years," she trailed off, unsure of how to finish the thought. So much had changed since they were children, and the person standing before her seemed like a stranger, yet familiar in so many ways. She remembered the long summer days they had spent playing in the royal gardens, sneaking out to explore the hidden corners of the palace, dreaming of a future together, though never once had they imagined a future filled with war. The war that had separated them, the war that had taken Kalen from her, and from the life they had known. Kalen's expression softened as if he, too, was fighting the pull of those memories. "I never wanted to leave, Leora," he said quietly, his voice laced with an emotion she hadn't expected. "But after everything that happened, I had to fight. I had to survive. And then, once the war began, I couldn't come back. Not until it was over." Leora's heart ached as she listened to his words. She had never known what had happened to him after he left. Had he been captured? Had he been lost to the war forever? She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering where he was, if he was alive, and if he still remembered her. To hear him speak now, so calmly, as if the years of separation hadn't broken her heart, left her both relieved and torn. "Kalen," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you were my best friend. I thought I lost you forever. And now, you're here, standing before me. A hero." He shook his head, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "I'm no hero, Leora. I'm just a soldier. I did what needed to be done." He looked away, his gaze clouding for a moment. "But I haven't forgotten. I haven't forgotten you." His words were like a balm to her heart, but they also stung, a painful reminder of how much time had passed and how much had changed. She wanted to ask him about everything. The years, the war, the choices he had made. But there was so much to say, and no way to fit it all into this one moment. The connection they once shared seemed to stretch out before them, tangled in years of separation, but it was still there, waiting to be found again. As they stood there in the quiet room, Leora knew one thing for certain. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But whatever happened, she wasn't going to lose him again, not without understanding the man Callan had become. Leora couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence that stretched between her and Callan. The reunion, though long awaited, felt surreal, like a dream she wasn't sure she could fully grasp. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, never believing it would actually come to pass. The boy she had known, the one who had shared so many memories with her, was now standing before her as a hardened soldier. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between the childhood friendship they once had and the complex, changed people they had become. But the words were elusive, tangled in a web of emotions that Leora didn't know how to untangle. "I didn't expect this," she admitted, her voice soft. "To see you again, to find out that you were here all along." There was a hint of disbelief in her tone, as if her mind couldn't quite make sense of the situation. Callan remained quiet for a moment, his gaze steady but filled with something Leora couldn't quite read. It was a strange mix of determination and sorrow, as if he had fought not only battles but also ghosts from the past. "I never planned for it to happen this way," Callan said slowly, his voice carrying the burden of his experiences. "When I left, I didn't know if I'd make it back. I didn't know if I'd be the same person when I did. But the war, it changed everything. And I knew, somehow, that I couldn't just disappear. I had to finish what I started. But I didn't know if you would even remember me when the war was over." Leora's heart twisted at his words. She had never stopped thinking about him, even when she had to bury those thoughts beneath the responsibilities of her role as princess. To hear Callan's raw honesty stirred emotions she thought she had long buried. The boy she had once known had carried those same feelings with him, even through the harshest of battles. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember the way we used to laugh together. I remember how it felt when you promised that nothing would ever come between us. I never wanted you to leave, Callan. I never wanted the war to take you away." Callan's expression softened, though his eyes remained troubled. He took a step closer, his voice lower now, almost regretful. "I never wanted to leave you, Leora. But war doesn't give you the luxury of choosing where you belong. It pulls you in, drags you to places you never imagined, and makes you into something you never thought you'd be. The boy you knew, he's gone. But the man before you, the soldier, he's done everything he could to survive." Leora felt her throat tighten. It was painful to hear him speak like that, as if the boy she had known was something distant, like a shadow from another life. And yet she saw the traces of him in Callan's eyes, the kindness, the courage, the friendship that had once seemed so unbreakable. But could she truly bridge the gap between the past and the present? Could she reconcile the soldier with the boy? "I don't know how to do this," Leora confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "How to be the princess and the friend, to be the leader and the person who longs to understand everything you've been through." She met his gaze, searching for answers. "But I need to try. For both of us." Callan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll try together," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "One step at a time." In that moment, Leora realized that their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The past, the present, and the future were all intertwined now, and it would take both of them to unravel it. But at least, for the first time in years, they would face it together. Leora sat quietly in her chambers, the weight of the past few days pressing heavily on her shoulders. The war was over, and her people were finally safe, but the peace felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. The palace, once filled with the sounds of military reports and battle plans, had fallen into an eerie silence. But it wasn't just the weight of leadership that was troubling her. It was the presence of Callan. He had returned to her life unexpectedly, And though their bond had always been strong, the years between them had turned that connection into something unfamiliar. She had thought that the boy she once knew, the one who had been her confidant and her closest friend, was lost to her forever. Yet here he was, standing at her side, a soldier scared by battle, but still carrying that flicker of something she recognized in his eyes. They had been through so much, and yet she felt as though they were still strangers. How could they pick up the pieces of their friendship after all this time? How could she reconcile the man Callan had become with the boy she remembered? The kingdom was in the process of rebuilding, but Leora's mind was elsewhere. She had spent days trying to find the right balance between her duty as a princess and her growing feelings for Callan. She didn't know what he wanted from her. Was he still the boy who once cared for her, or had the war changed him too much? And yet, she found herself constantly drawn to him, unable to ignore the pull between them. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leora found herself walking through the royal gardens, seeking solace in the familiar sights of her childhood. She hadn't expected Callan to be there, but when she turned a corner, she saw him standing near the fountain, his back to her. He hadn't heard her approach, and for a brief moment, Leora simply stood there, watching him. The man before her was so different from the Callan she remembered. His shoulders were broader now, his stance more rigid, as if the weight of the world had shaped him into something unrecognizable. And yet, when he turned to face her, there was that same glint in his eyes, the same warmth she had always known. "I didn't expect to see you here," Leora said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Callan smiled, though it was a smile that seemed tinged with sadness. "I needed some time away from the chaos," he replied, his voice carrying a weight of its own. "I'm not used to peace, Leora. After everything, it's hard to believe it's real." Leora nodded, her heart aching at the truth in his words. "I know what you mean. The war has changed so many things, but we can't keep living in the past, Callan. We have to find a way to move forward." Callan's gaze softened as he stepped closer. "I don't want to move forward without understanding what happened, what we've both been through." He paused, his expression serious. "I know I've changed, but I still care about you, Leora. I always have." Her breath caught in her throat at his words. The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored her own, and for the first time since their reunion, she felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they once had, if they were both willing to take the first step together. "I care about you too," Leora whispered, her heart racing. "But we'll have to figure it out, step by step." And in that moment, she knew that their journey, though uncertain, was something they would face together. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of reflection and cautious steps forward. Leora spent her time navigating the delicate balance between her responsibilities as the ruler of her kingdom and the growing, unexpected feelings for Callan. The palace buzzed with activity as the people celebrated the end of the war, but for Leora, there was a constant sense of unease, as though everything was shifting beneath her feet. The weight of her crown had never felt heavier, and yet the presence of Callan in her life, so familiar and yet so changed, kept pulling her in a direction she wasn't sure she was ready to go. Callan, for his part, had become a quiet force within the palace. His military expertise had proven invaluable in securing the kingdom's borders and maintaining order. But it wasn't just his skill with strategy that Leora admired. It was the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else could. They had shared a history, a past that bound them together. And yet now they were both unsure of what that bond meant. Was it the foundation of something more? Or was it simply a relic of a childhood long gone, a friendship that had been swallowed by the chaos of the war? One evening, as the moonlight bathed the palace grounds in a silvery glow, Leora found herself wandering through the quiet halls, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had spent most of the day buried in royal affairs, trying to rebuild the kingdom. But tonight she couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. She paused outside the grand library, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, she saw Callan standing by the window, looking out over the city. The soft glow of the candles flickered around him, casting shadows on the walls, but it was his stillness that caught her attention. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man, caught between the past and the present, between duty and desire. Lyora stepped inside, her footsteps light on the marble floor. Callan didn't turn when she entered, but she could feel his awareness of her presence, like a magnetic pull between them. The silence was thick with unspoken words, and she hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. After all, they had been through so much, too much, perhaps, to just pick up where they left off. But as she watched him, standing there so distant yet so close, she realized that she couldn't keep avoiding the truth. "Callan," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "What happens now?" He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, Lyora thought she saw something vulnerable there, something that mirrored her own uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I do know that I don't want to walk away from this. From us." Lyora's heart skipped a beat. "From us," she repeated, the weight of the words sinking in. She had spent so long convincing herself that the war had changed everything, that they could never return to what they once were. But standing here now, with Callan's gaze unwavering and sincere, she realized that the past didn't have to define their future. "I don't know what the future holds, Callan," Lyora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe, just maybe, we can figure it out together. Step by step." Callan stepped closer, the distance between them now almost non-existent. "Together," he repeated, his voice filled with quiet determination. In that moment, Lyora knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and fears to overcome. But with Callan by her side, she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. They were no longer the children they once were, but perhaps they could find their way back to each other. This time as something more than just friends. And as the moonlight bathed them both, Lyora realized that this was only the beginning of a new chapter for them both. The days following their quiet conversation felt like the beginning of something new, though Lyora and Callan both knew that the path ahead would not be easy. Despite the peace that had settled over the kingdom, there was an unspoken tension between them, a hesitation that lingered in the air. Lyora threw herself into her royal duties, ensuring that the kingdom was rebuilt and the people's needs were met. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't ignore the weight of Callan's presence. He was there, a constant in her life, yet there was still so much they needed to understand about each other. Callan, ever the soldier, had returned to his work with quiet determination. He had earned the respect of the people, not just through his military success, but by showing the same loyalty and courage that had defined his childhood. Yet beneath his stoic exterior, Lyora could see the conflict within him. He was still fighting, though now it was a battle against the remnants of his past and the uncertainty of his future. Lyora knew that he was struggling to reconcile the man he had become with the boy he once was. One evening, as the sun set over the palace, casting an orange glow across the sky, Lyora found herself standing on the balcony, gazing out at the quiet city below. The wind carried the scent of fresh flowers from the gardens, but it did little to ease the tension in her chest. She couldn't stop thinking about Callan, about the soldier he had become, and the boy who had once been her closest friend. Could they truly find their way back to each other? Or was the distance between them now too great to bridge? Just as her thoughts began to cloud her mind, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Callan standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the room behind him. He stepped forward, his presence steady and reassuring. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Lyora smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just need some time to think," she replied, her gaze returning to the horizon. "There's so much to do, so much I need to figure out." Callan didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside her, his presence a comforting weight. After a few moments of silence, he spoke again, this time more softly. You don't have to do it alone, Leora. I'm here. I always will be. Leora turned to face him, her heart catching in her throat. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the same sincerity that had once made her trust him with her deepest thoughts and fears. But I don't know if I can balance it all, she admitted, her voice wavering. The kingdom, my people, and us. Kalen stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. You don't have to balance it all alone. We'll figure it out together, step by step, no matter how difficult it gets. For the first time in weeks, Leora felt the knot in her chest loosen. She had spent so long carrying the weight of her kingdom, afraid to lean on anyone, but standing there with Kalen beside her, she realized she didn't have to do it all alone. They had both been changed by the war, but they hadn't lost everything. There was still something between them, something worth fighting for. As they stood together, the setting sun casting its final rays over the land, Leora knew that the future was uncertain. But with Kalen by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. The days that followed felt like a quiet, hesitant peace, a fragile balance between the duties Leora had to fulfill as queen and the personal emotions she was only just beginning to confront. She had never imagined that her life would be so complicated, so full of decisions that pulled her in different directions. The weight of her crown had always been heavy, but now it seemed even heavier, with Kalen's presence constantly at her side. He was no longer just the soldier who had helped win the war. He was someone she couldn't stop thinking about, someone whose presence tugged at her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Kalen, ever the soldier, had resumed his role as a trusted advisor, helping Leora navigate the political landscape of the kingdom as it recovered from the ravages of war. But there was a distance between them, unspoken yet undeniable. They were no longer the children who had spent carefree days together in the palace gardens. The years apart had changed them both in ways they couldn't ignore. Yet despite the space between them, Leora found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't been prepared for. There was something in his eyes, in the way he spoke to her, that made her feel as though they could still find their way back to the connection they had once shared. One evening, as Leora sat in her study, going through the reports from the various provinces of her kingdom, she heard a soft knock at the door. She looked up to find Kalen standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the warm light of the hallway. There was something different about him today, his expression softer, more open, as if he had come to a decision that had been weighing on him. "May I come in?" Kalen asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge of uncertainty. Leora nodded, motioning for him to enter. "Of course. What brings you here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. She wasn't sure why his presence always had this effect on her, but it seemed impossible to ignore. Kalen closed the door behind him and approached her desk. He didn't sit, but instead stood there, looking at her with an intensity that made Leora feel as though everything she had been avoiding was suddenly coming to the forefront. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quieter now, "about what you said before. About figuring it all out, step by step." Leora's breath caught in her throat. "Kalen, I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight," Kalen interrupted gently, "but I need you to know something. I'm not just here because of the war or because of duty. I'm here because I want to be. I'm here because I've never stopped caring about you, Leora." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Leora said nothing. She didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long burying her feelings, focusing on the kingdom and the people who needed her, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly vulnerable, to allow herself to care for someone else. Finally, she stood up, her eyes meeting his. "I've been thinking the same thing," she whispered. "But we can't just pick up where we left off. There's too much that's changed." Kalen stepped closer, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I know, but we don't have to pick up where we left off. We can start somewhere new, together." Leora's heart skipped a beat as she looked into his eyes. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. There were still many challenges ahead, many obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle within her. Maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. As time passed, Lyora and Callan grew more accustomed to their new reality. The kingdom, though still recovering from the war, had begun to find its footing again. People were rebuilding their homes, replanting crops, and reclaiming what they had lost. But for Lyora, the real rebuilding was happening within herself. She had spent so many years hiding behind the walls of her responsibilities, convinced that the kingdom was all that mattered, that she had pushed aside her own emotions. Now, with Callan by her side, she was beginning to understand that there was more to life than just duty. The first few weeks after their heart-to-heart conversation had been full of small, quiet moments. They worked together to ensure that the kingdom remained strong, but in the quiet spaces between the demands of leadership, they began to find their way back to each other. The bond that had once been so easy, so natural, was slowly being rebuilt, not as it had been, but as something new, something stronger. One afternoon, as Lyora walked through the palace gardens, she found Callan waiting near the same fountain, where they had once shared childhood memories. He had always been a part of the palace, a constant presence in her life, even if the years had distanced them. Now, though, he was more than just a familiar face. He was someone she could trust, someone who had proven time and time again that he would stand by her side. As she approached, Callan turned to face her, his expression softening when he saw her. "I've been thinking," Lyora began, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her thoughts, "about everything that's happened. The war, the kingdom, and us." Callan nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I've been thinking too," he replied, "about how much has changed and how much is still ahead of us. I won't pretend that I have all the answers, Lyora, but I know this. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Lyora felt her chest tighten at his words. She had feared that once the war was over, once the kingdom was safe, things would return to the way they were before. But she realized now that nothing could ever go back to the way it was. They had both changed, and they had to accept that. The boy she had known was no longer the boy who had left, and she was no longer the girl who had once played in the gardens with him. But the connection between them was undeniable, and in the quiet moments they shared, Lyora knew they were building something that was uniquely theirs, something worth fighting for. "I don't want to rush anything, Callan," Lyora said softly, her gaze steady on his. "But I do want to see where this goes. I want to build a future, not just for the kingdom, but for us." Callan stepped closer, his expression sincere. "We'll take it one step at a time, Lyora. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Not as a princess and her soldier, but as partners, equals." Lyora smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. With Callan by her side, she knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. And as the sun set over the kingdom, casting a warm glow over the palace gardens, Lyora realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for them both, one filled with hope, possibility, and love.